Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for sharing your afternoon with me. This is a talk about common prosperity, 共同繁荣. It is a talk about equality and efficiency, and it is a talk about inequality and social unrest. To start this lecture, let me draw a picture for you. This is a picture that we see around the world. It is a picture about governments having conversations with their people. Government and people both describe the following. They paint a vivid picture. They say, we need to tighten the regulation of industry. We need to make antitrust competition policy more rigorous. We need to enforce rules more strongly. Why do we want to do this? Because we want to bring under control the multi-billionaire owners and the top executives of our nation's most powerful businesses, our nation's largest firms. And we want to do this so that we can give our workers, our consumers, more of a control in the workings of companies and more of a say in the distribution of their earnings. We don't want to see inequality continue to be so great between multi-billionaires and ordinary people. In this picture, the story is, if we, the government, or our political leaders, or the people themselves say, if we don't do this, there will be social unrest because people will be unhappy at such a big disparity in how much the rich have and how much ordinary people have. If we don't do this, the potential for instability will grow more and more. However, we have to be careful and moderated when we do this. Because if we just go out and we tighten industry regulation, we bring under control multi-billionaire owners, top executives, when we do that, we wipe out billions of dollars of value from those businesses. And the wealth of those, the value of those businesses is part of the wealth of the nation. We need to have greater equality, but when we do that, we realize that we might destroy wealth. And wealth destruction can be much more rapid than wealth creation. This is the conversation the whole world is having in China, in all other countries. This is how in the modern world we view what is a basic trade-off between equality on the one hand and efficiency and value on the other. When we think about those big businesses and we give them names, we call them out, we say Didi, Ant Group, Alibaba, TikTok, Huoshan, we recognize that this kind of a conversation is happening in China today. But at the same time, if we name those businesses Facebook, Google, Apple, Microsoft, we name those businesses Goldman Sachs, we name those banks, large international banks on Wall Street, the sentiment, the feeling and the emotions is all the same. this challenge of trying to achieve common prosperity, to lower inequality without destroying wealth, is a challenge all over the world. It's a challenge not only all over the world, it's a challenge all through history. 50 years ago, when I was just starting out my studies in economics, I know I'm very old. 50 years ago, I was already a university student. I read books like Arthur Okun's book, Equality and Efficiency. And Arthur Okun discussed this concept of the trade-off between equality and efficiency using the concept of a leaky bucket. The leaky bucket that is in the title screen that you see. The idea in that book was concentrated in that book because it was written by an American for an American audience. It was concentrated in capitalist societies. Capitalist societies that wanted to undertake policy measures to achieve equality, the same kinds of concerns we have today. That book was about redistributing income and wealth from rich to poor. And that book described the process of redistribution as being like carrying water in a leaky bucket. You were carrying water from those who had a lot to those who had very little water. You were redistributing income and wealth from those who were rich to those who were poor. But the more you try to bring water from those who have a lot to those who have less, in other words, the more you try and flatten the income distribution, the greater is the amount of water that leaks onto the ground. And when that water leaks on the ground, it doesn't do people any good. You can't drink it anymore. It is lost to society. The more you try and do redistribution, the less efficient becomes your enemy, becomes your economy. So here, as articulated in Arthur Okun's book 50 years ago, in the concept of common prosperity that I've just described, throughout all of human history and across all nations, is the big problem. No matter the political system that we live in, even as all of us need to face up to the challenge of inequality, we have to navigate this trade-off. All of you, when you go back and are policymakers, advising your governments, local or national, about how to deal with the challenge of inequality, you will have to deal with this trade-off between equality and efficiency. This is the topic of my talk today. My talk today is going to pose the question, what if inequality is not the enemy? What if the reason that people might be angry in society, the reason that there might be social unrest, the reason that societies might become unstable is actually not inequality, but something else? And that all along, Arthur Okun, the way that many of us understand common prosperity, is maybe not the whole story. What if this view that inequality is what we're trying to reduce is the wrong view? The argument that I want to make this afternoon, looking at data, looking at economies around the world, is an attempt to say that maybe inequality is not the enemy. Now, when I do this, of course, I'm actually arguing against a very distinguished, well-established intellectual history. None other than Confucius, thousands of years ago, already said this: 不患寡而患不均. What is disturbing is not scarcity or widowhood or anything else, but inequality. Confucius agrees with Arthur Okun. Confucius agrees that common prosperity should be thought about in terms of reducing inequality. Yet here I am trying to argue that that's not the right view. In fact, Confucius is not alone in arguing this. The Pope, Pope Francis, also said the same thing. Pope Francis said inequality is the root of social evil. Former President Barack Obama said that the greatest obstacle, the defining challenge of our time, is how to reduce inequality. But I want to give a little bit of evidence this afternoon to say that maybe these three people and others like them, maybe we want to change their view. We want to go up to them and say, maybe you're not right. Maybe there's something wrong in the way you think about things. So what I want to do is to make that argument. That argument over the course of the COVID pandemic in so much of the world seems to be even more right. Okay. China's experience in the coronavirus pandemic is a little bit different from that in the rest of the world. Let me not try and say, to Brazilians what their experience is like, to Americans what their experience is like. Let me just talk about Singapore, this nation that you have spent the last months, the last year living in and studying. In Singapore, over the coronavirus pandemic, the story described in this picture has been told over and over again. The story is when you look on one side of the picture, there are poor people. On the other side of the picture, there are rich people. Over the pandemic, with lockdown, jobs were lost. People couldn't go to work. The people who could keep working were the people who could do remote working, online working, the people on the right side of the picture. Over the pandemic in Singapore, schools shut down. So there was home-based learning. Students had to take lessons from home over Wi-Fi and the internet. This picture shows the difference in experiences. On the right side of this picture are rich parents who are working remotely from home. They can log in over the internet and they can still get their jobs with their work done. Their children have wonderful school home-based environments. They have new computers. They're learning well in home-based learning. Home-based learning, not a problem. On the left side of this picture is a poorer family. And in this poorer family, the parents are having to stay at home and they're losing their jobs. When they cannot go to work, the jobs that they do cannot be done over the internet. They've lost their jobs. Their incomes are gone. Their children are using borrowed computers. Their children don't even have proper desks to work on. They're working on chairs, they're working on boxes instead of the nice desks that the people on the right side have. This is inequality over the coronavirus pandemic. In so much of the world, people like to say, this is the experience in Singapore. And so, obviously, Barack Obama, Pope Francis, Confucius were all right. This kind of inequality is not appropriate. The poor people on the left side are suffering. But let me pose all of us here a question. How would the lives of poor people be better off if there were no rich people in society? If there were no rich people in society, would the poor people be able to go to work? No, the coronavirus would still shut their factories. If there were no rich people with fast Wi-Fi, would the Wi-Fi of the poor children be faster? Would their desks be better? Would they have good work environments? The answer to all these questions is no. The reason that poor people are suffering over the pandemic is because they are poor, not because there are rich people living one street over. The problem can be described in this way. When poor people are suffering, they're suffering because they have inadequate resources. When poor people suffer, it is not because there's a disparity between those poor people and rich people. Disparity is not responsible for the misery poor people suffer. Now, some people might say, wait a minute. Can't in rich societies, the rich people give some of their resources to the poor people? Wouldn't that be a good thing? And I would say, yes, definitely. But the reason that is good is because it solves the problem of resource inadequacy. It's because we use disparity to solve the problem of resource inadequacy. It's not disparity that's the problem. It's resource inadequacy that's the problem. The reason that people are angry in societies, the reason that there's social unrest in societies is because poor people don't have enough control over their own lives, over their own destiny. And that is because they don't have enough resources, not because there are rich people around them in society. The real problem is not disparity. The real problem is resource inadequacy. That is the hypothesis I want to advance to you. And that is why I think it is wrong for us to try and attack the problem of inequality. Let me give you some evidence on why I say this, not just from the logic, why there is evidence that supports what I've just said. Let's go back to that picture. This is the picture, poor people, rich people. Poor people don't have a very nice life, rich people do. According to this thinking, there's inequality. And so it's terrible that poor people have to suffer. Let me change the picture a bit. This is a picture of just the poor people. Are their lives better off? No, their lives are exactly still the same. Whether there are rich people in society or there are no rich people in society, the plight of these poorer people, the weak and vulnerable society, is exactly the same, whether or not there is inequality or there is no inequality. And in fact, the only reason that we think inequality has something to do with this is because we think rich people can help solve this problem. We can take something from rich people and give it to poor people. In other words, inequality gives us the opportunity to fix the problem of resource inadequacy. Inequality is not the problem. Let me give you some international evidence now on what I have just said, including evidence for China. And then I will conclude. This is a graph that shows Singapore's experience over the last 40 years. The line that's in blue, 蓝色的, is the line that shows inequality in Singapore. The line that's in red shows the situation of the poor in Singapore. So when you look at the left side of this picture, we see that in Singapore, inequality is rising. It's getting higher and higher. Sometimes it slows down, sometimes it falls. But over the last 40, 50 years, Singapore inequality has gotten worse and worse. What is happening to the lives of poorer people in Singapore. The red line at the bottom of the left side of the picture shows the average income of the bottom half of the population. And in this picture, it shows like, well, the poor people are still actually quite poor. True. But when you look at the right side of this picture, this actually shows the poor people taken by themselves. It shows the average income of the bottom half of the Singapore population. And we see from the right side of this graph that actually, even as inequality has risen in Singapore, the incomes of the bottom 50% have actually risen as well, almost 4 times today what they were 50 years ago. Today, if you're poor in Singapore, you have 4 times the level of income, inflation adjusted, than the same poor person did 50 years ago. You are actually richer. You have more control over the things around you. You have greater control of your own destiny. This first picture says that inequality is no obstacle to the poor being lifted. I show this picture to my friends around the world. They say, hi, this is just Singapore. Singapore is so different from everyone else. This doesn't happen anywhere else in the world. So then I show them this picture. This is a picture of the economy that you all know much better than I do. It's a picture of China. In China, the blue line, which again shows inequality, shows that between 1980 and 2000, inequality fell. But for the last 2-3 decades, it has risen very fast. This is the reason we are worrying about common prosperity. Then we look at the bottom of the picture that shows the income of the bottom 50%. Do as I did just a second ago, put on the right side the behavior of incomes of poor people by itself. And what we see there is that in China, the bottom 50% at first had their incomes decline. With the beginnings of urbanization, growth of the manufacturing sector, reduction of the agricultural sector, overall incomes actually fell. But then from 1995 onwards, and then very sharply after the year 2000, 2001, when China joined the World Trade Organization, the incomes of the poor people suddenly rose, and they have risen faster than most other countries have grown. Just the poor people in China are an economy that grows faster than most other nations everywhere else in the world. Not only that, but you notice that for the China experience, the poor people suffered when inequality fell. Between 1980 and 2000, incomes of the poor declined. What happened to inequality? Inequality also declined. In China's experience shows that when inequality fell, the incomes of the poor fell. When inequality rose, the incomes of the poor rose. Inequality is not the enemy. It is not the case that when inequality rises, the poor get squeezed. That would happen if it were a zero-sum game. If there were a fixed pie that we are dividing and we give more to the rich, obviously the poor get less. But China's economy was not fixed. China's economy was growing very fast. As China's economy grew, everybody got more. True, the rich got proportionally more, and that's why inequality rose. But remember, the last time the rich didn't get proportionally more, everybody's incomes fell, including those for the very poor. When I show people these two pictures, Singapore and China, my American friends say, hi, that's just Singapore and China. That's not how the world is. So let me show you the world. This is what the world looks like. When you look across over 100 countries, over and over, you find that their experiences are exactly the same as Singapore's experience and China's experience. This graph plots the experience of over 100 countries around the world. It is positively sloped. The vertical axis shows how much inequality has increased over the last 40 years. The horizontal axis shows how much the incomes of the poor have increased over the last 40 years. Because this line is upward sloping, we see that when inequality rises, the poor also benefit. When inequality is held low, the poor actually suffer. This sounds like trickle-down economics. It is not. I am not saying that you need the rich to become rich before the poor can also become rich. Not at all. I'm just saying that in the world, it so happens that whether causality is from the poor becoming rich and then inequality, or whether causality is from inequality to the poor, whatever you think inequality is, it's almost a necessary and sufficient condition that inequality rise at the same time that you see poor people rise. And I want to be very careful, because when I explain this to my American friends, they say, no, that doesn't make any sense. And I say, absolutely true. 我美国的朋友, absolutely true, my American friends. It is not necessary and sufficient. Because you know what? There's one country in the world where this fails. Which country is that? America. In America, over the last 40 years, when inequality rose, the poor in America became poorer. Not just relatively poorer, absolutely poorer. So if America is telling the world, you have this trade-off, I say to them, you have this trade-off. The rest of the world is quite different from you. For the rest of the world, these are the key implications. In 100 economies, when inequality rose, 95% of them also showed the poor rising. In 110 economies, when the poor rose, inequality rose in 90% of them. Inequality and the lifting of the poor are almost necessary and sufficient conditions for each other. They're not mathematically or logically that, because they're counterexamples, and America is one of them. I am finished. This is the evidence I've tried to present to you. I began by saying how so much of the world is dealing with the challenge of inequality, how so many great thinkers have identified inequality as the problem. I want to say that the evidence makes us all a little bit more circumspect. The evidence should make us all a little bit more cautious in how we tackle the problem of inequality. Let me leave you with 3 thoughts. First, every nation has to deal with the challenge of inequality. Every nation has to do that. Don't listen to anyone saying China has a problem with common prosperity. China is trying to deal with it in communist ways. It's not. Everybody is dealing with that. Singapore is dealing with this. America is dealing with this. Western Europe is dealing with this. Everybody is dealing with the challenge of inequality. And they're approaching this using the perspective of Arthur Okun's leaky buckets. There's a trade-off between inequality and prosperity, inequality and efficiency. What I've tried to do in my research, a little bit of which I've described to you, is to suggest that that's actually the wrong view. There are problems in the world. Those problems have to do with resource inadequacy. Yet the poor are still so poor. That is not a problem of inequality. Those problems have to do with people's expectations about how over their lifetime they should continue to get richer. That's not a problem of inequality. That's a problem of social mobility. Resource inadequacy, social mobility are genuine problems. Inequality is not. I know some of you have come from backgrounds that are quite technical, engineering or medicine, and most of you will have studied some statistics. In statistics, there's the concept of what's called a sufficient statistic. It's the one number you look at that tells you everything you need to know about the problem. My proposition is inequality is not that number. Don't focus on inequality. Stagnation and resource inadequacy are the genuine challenges. Let me conclude by doing a little advertising. My advertising is this. At the Lee Kuan Yew School, and I'm so pleased to count Shilu, Chen Kang, Wu Chen, Pei Wen, and all my other friends on the screen who work with me at the Lee Kuan Yew School. Because at the Lee Kuan Yew School, we have started something called the Social Mobility Foundation. And the Social Mobility Foundation's work is to try and apply scientific evidence to better guide policy on social mobility and social cohesion. When we see countries incorrectly identifying the social challenges that they face, we need to stand up to them and speak truth to power, to tell them that's not the right problem. Here, this is the right problem. Social immobility, the erosion of social cohesion, but not inequality. I've reached the end of my 30 minutes. I want to thank you all very much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion